Moshe Tarragon for the OU's All Parsha video series of Shiurim, speaking from Gush Etzion, still thinking about the Nisim that we were Zocha to. I won't speak about this directly, but Chazal are very critical of Chizkiah for not reciting Shira to HaKadosh Baruch Hu after the Nisim B'Niflos that he and the besieged people of Yerushalayim were Zocha to when Sennacherib's army was obliterated overnight. The same story unfolds in Zechariah, Perek Daled, where some of the people from the original generation who had seen the first Beis HaMikdash were unable to celebrate the Nisim of returning to Yerushalayim and building the second Beis HaMikdash, even though our Yeshua is still partial and we're still living in murky times. The Nisim we were Zocha to the last 2 weeks in Eretz Yisrael. Unfortunately, military officials were expecting close to, God forbid, I don't want to say the number, thousands of casualties, preparing for that, willing to accept that as a legitimate but harsh price to pay for avoiding a nuclear holocaust, or the potential for nuclear holocaust by the Iranians. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent us his Yeshua. Unfortunately, about 30 people did lose their lives, and thousands of people are homeless, and of course several thousand are injured. We don't want to overlook that or sugarcoat their suffering or ignore their suffering. So everyone should try to find a way to register the NACE. And typically the way to register a NACE is not just cognitively or intellectually, but to try to give expression, to say Shira HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to make it a Shira Chadasha, Shibchu Ge'ulim, when you're a Goel, when you're Nigal. It has to be new and vibrant and contemporary and updated. Some people in Eretz Yisrael this week said Hallel. A lot of people, probably those listening to this year, are of an orientation where you don't say Hallel that often, finding Prakim in Tehillim to add, not just the Shir HaMalos Mima Makim or Shir HaMalos Asa'inai, my two favorites, but you can choose your own because they're so well known and you don't need a sitter, but they really capture some of the mood. Is Perek Kuf, Mizmor L'Soda Ril Hashem Kol Haaretz, 4 or 5 psukim, and Perek Lamed, Mizmor Shir Chanukah Savayis LeDavid. You know them, you recite them in davening, but to recite them specially and to think about the Nisim and not just mouth words, but what did we experience and what were the dynamics and what were the fears and how did the Yeshua come. Anyway, getting back to Parshas Chukas. Parshas Chukas contains a really fascinating satire. Satire is when you say one thing and you mean not just another thing, you mean something inverse. A metaphor means you mean A and B. A satire means you mean A and not A. And the more that you stress the A, the more that you uncover the not A. And it's a satiric section as Am Yisrael are battling Sichon, Melech HaAmori. We're given a lot of military information about the war between Amori and Moav. Now, at a practical, historical level, the war between Sichon, Melech HaAmori, and the people of Moav on the eastern bank of the Jordan River is historically impactful. Because Al Tatzar es Moav, we're not allowed to battle Moav. Moav is a descendant of Lot, part of the same family. Moav is going to be the ancestor of David HaMelech. For all sorts of reasons, Moav is hands off. Amori is a different story. They're part of the Amori tribe. The Amori tribe is also resident in Eretz Yisrael, in Eretz Canaan. And this was a savage, paganistic, idolatrous, bloody tribe. And ultimately we did vanquish Sichon. But there was a prior war between Sichon, Melech HaAmori, at least the Amoraim and the Moabites, and the implications of that war were very, very significant for Am Yisrael. Had Moav victored and maintained their lands, those lands would have been off limits to Am Yisrael because we're not allowed to war with Moav. Fortunately, from our perspective, Sichon vanquished Moav, a decisive victory. All the lands of Moav, many of the lands of Moav were transferred to Sichon. And subsequently, and consequently, when we defeated Sichon, those lands then transferred, reverted to Am Yisrael, ultimately to be settled by the 2.5 Shvatim, Reuven, Gad, and half of the Shevet of Menashe. So the Torah has to inform us of the lands that we would conquer from Sichon. These were lands not just that Sichon and Amori had owned, but that they took from Moav. But the degree of detail seems to be disproportionate to the function of these psukim. Ki Cheshbon ir Sichon, this is Pasuk Chavav. Cheshbon is the city of Sichon, Melech HaAmori. V'hu nilcham be'eretz Moav, and he captured it from Eretz Moav. Vayikach es kol artzon miado ad Arnon. And Sichon took all the lands of Moab till Arnon. Al Kain, and now all the bards, B-A-R-D, bards were early poets, and many of their poems and songs were about war. Think about Homer, think about the Iliad, think about all the wars that poets spoke about. They didn't have YouTube, they didn't have sports, they didn't have baseball games, they didn't have movies. So they gathered and heard the poem, or the poet describe the great wars of Troy, or these were the great wars of Sichon and Cheshbon. Al-Kain Yamua Moshlim, all the bards and poets. Bo Cheshbon, let's gather into Cheshbon. And it's not just the poets, but it's also the politicians. This is actually the poets talking about all the politicians and diplomats who gather into Cheshbon, which was the metropolis. That was the metropolis on the East Bank. Tibonev v'tikonei near Sichon. Now that Sichon has captured Cheshbon from Moab, that city should be built and established because it's now Sichon's. Now, how did Sichon acquire it? Ki eish yatsa mi-Cheshbon, because a fire came out to Cheshbon. Leva mikriyat Sichon. A flame came shooting out from the center of Sichon, Achla ar Moab, it consumed Moab's cities, Baalei Barmos Arnon, and the highlands of Arnon. Oy lecha Moab, here the poet is bemoaning and wailing. Woe is to you, the people of Moab. Avadata am Kemosh, you've lost the people of Kemosh. Nasam banav pleitim, the children have become refugees. Uvenotav bashvit, and the daughters are now being taken captive. Lamelech Amori, who conquered you in the war. Vani Ramavad Cheshbon, and you also lost the kingdom of Cheshbon. Hiram is the king. He lost Cheshbon to Sichon. Ad Divon, till the lands of Divon. Vanashim, and you also lost from Nashim. Ad Nofach, Asher Ad Meva. Wow, there is a lot of information here that's not necessary. All we really need to know is that Sichon conquered Moab and all the lands were taken, and then we conquered those lands. Who cares about Nofach, Niram, Nashim, Medva? Who cares about Bamos Arnon, the highlands of Arnon? Who cares about the fire? Who cares about Oy lecha Moab? Why are we bemoaning? The Torah has entire mesechtos that are predicated on an extra letter, if at all, and here an entire pasuk bemoaning and wailing the great losses of Moab and describing the politicians gathering in Cheshbon, maybe to sign a peace treaty, maybe to go to war. Hard to know. A lot of information here, TMI, about an event that only marginally affects Jewish history on the east bank of the Jordan. So because it's so disproportionate and a lot to do about nothing, as Shakespeare himself would say and write and title his book, Chazal saw that there's a deeper message. And I want to read, I'm reading it out of a Torah Tamima, just as it's easier to find it, but it's a Gemara in Bava Basra, one of my favorite Gemaras. And again, I read the pasuk that the Gemara hones in on, and we'll see how the Gemara redirects it. I believe it's Shmuel, the name of Rabbi Yonasan, Shmuel Bar Nachmani. Again, the pasuk in the middle of this whole saga, this whole war story, Al Kain, Yamra Moshlim. The rulers say, let's gather in Cheshbon, let's go to the city of Sichon, because a fire came out of Cheshbon, a flame from Sichon to conquer Cheshbon from Moab, and it consumed Moab. Woe are the children of Moab. Your sons have been taken refugee, and your children have been kidnapped and hostage taken. So according to Chazal, all these three psukim are one big satire, because you and I think that the real story is unfolding in the metropolis of Cheshbon with the rulers of the world and the outcome of the war and the refugees and the captives and the hostages and the lands that have been conquered. But Chazal say as follows, Al Kain Yamuha Moshlim Bo Cheshbon. Who are the Moshlim? Not the diplomats, not the generals, not the presidents, not the tyrants, not the kings, not the monarchs, not the soldiers, but Elu HaMoshlim B'Yitzram. People who control their impulses, people who impose moral will upon their desires, upon their needs, upon their weaknesses. Bo Cheshbon, how do they exercise that control? They conduct Cheshbon HaNefeshes. They think about, not just Cheshbon HaNefesh in the micro sense, what did I do right today? What did I do wrong today? Which is important from time to time. Sometimes it can become a little bit obsessive and fixating if every day you're conducting a Cheshbon HaNefesh. As Rav Lichtenstein once paraphrased the pasuk of Shlomo in Koheles, B'chal Eisiyu B'gadecha Livanim, your clothing should always be white. And Rav Aaron once said, well, that doesn't mean turning life into a perpetual laundry. You're not always whitening your clothes. You're living life, and once in a while, you want to check your behavior. But it's also more of a macro analysis. Schar mitzvah negative seda, schar avera negative seda. Every avera is a schar, the pleasure, the need you serve, the insecurity you attend to. And of course, it has a hefsid, and the hefsid of an avera is much worse than the schar, much more steep than the schar. Every avera is a sacrifice or a barter of eternity for transience. And that's a very, very poor exchange. And the same with a mitzvah. Every mitzvah has a cost. Whatever sacrifice, whatever limitation, whatever work you have to do that you'd rather not, but you have other things that you may want to spend time on. And of course, the hefsed is paramount, and therefore, the schar is enormous, and therefore overwhelms whatever investment, financial or otherwise, you have to make. So the Alkein Yarmu HaMoshlim are not the dictators and the diplomats and the generals and the kings and the monarchs, but the people who exercise moral will, Bo Cheshbon, let's conduct the Cheshbon HaNefesh, and if so, then Ti Banev V'Tikonein Ir Moav. If that happens, or Sichon, if that happens, then the city will be built sturdy. What is the city being built sturdy? It doesn't mean the city of Cheshbon. It means the city of a human heart, the city of a human soul, the city of a human life. But if you fail and you don't build the city, then the fire will consume you and the fire will overcome you. That's a person who follows his own will, who ascends the highlands of Bamas Arnon, who becomes haughty and vain. And so this whole story about the dictators, tyrants, and kings gathering in Cheshbon, deciding either to go to war or to end the war, it's hard to know, the fire coming from Sichon, consuming Moab, you and I think it's the war. And essentially, it's a code for a moral war that takes place on the internal landscape or the internal battlefield of the human heart and the human moral saga. And the real leaders are not the monarchs, but people who control their Yetzer Hara. And Cheshbon is not a city, it's a calculus of sin and a calculus of mitzvos. And the consequences are either a city will be built sturdy or the fire will come out and eliminate the city and cause trauma and hardship and devastation and metaphorically children being left as refugees and daughters being taken as hostages. Now what makes this so satirical is that the literary reading of the Psukim and Chazal's drasha are antithetical. Namely, what shapes reality? What shapes our world? Wars, diplomacy, generals, kings, or the internal moral battle? And it seems, at least to the naked eye, the literary reading, when you read the Psukim text, what first hits you, well, it's whatever's in the headlines, and whatever wars are being fought, whatever treaties are being signed, whatever leverages are being exerted, that's what shapes human history. And if you look a little deeper, you realize that headlines come and go, politics comes and goes, monarchs come and go, empires rise and fall. So it's 2025 as we recite this shir. Does anyone listening to this shir, maybe aside from the archaeologists and the Mideast or Near East, ancient Near East historians, does anyone know where Cheshbon was? Does anyone really care? Does anyone know who those Moshlim were, the nondescript, unnamed leaders that gathered for this summit meeting in Cheshbon, the big metropolis that everyone gathered to, that had all the shops and markets and comings and goings? They've long since vanished from this world. Does anyone know where the Bamos Arnon are, the highlands of Arnon? Maybe you could look it up in the Tanakh, but does anyone really care that they were the highlands of Arnon? Does anyone really know where Divon, Nashim, Nofach, and Medva were? These are just coordinates that have long since disappeared from history. So if you were living through these wars and following the headlines of the Mesopotamian Gazette or the Hammurabi, Hammurabi Times, whatever people were reading those days on their tablets, I don't mean their Apple tablets, but on their stone tablets, obviously they weren't reading any newspapers, you would think these are going to shape history. The big war between Sichon, the fierce warrior, the king of Amori, and Moab, and who's going to win, and what boundaries will be set, what boundaries will not be set, and who even knows who Sichon was, who even knows who Moab was, where they were, where the battles, they've long since faded from history. But moral decisions, brave moral decisions, they ripple with impact far, far beyond the moment in which they are taken. These decisions, even though they don't appear in headlines and people aren't paying attention to them, moral energy shapes history much more impactfully than headlines. And I think for people that are involved in both, it's more of a delicate balancing act. There are some Orthodox Jews today who completely disdain or disavow the world of Ishtadlus, the world of politics, the world of war. It's all Siyata Dishmaya, Tara Magna. We occupy a purely metaphysical realm, and that's the sole realm in which history is shaped. And I assume for most people, I think, listening to the share, we are involved in both realms. And though we know that the metaphysical realm of moral decisions, Torah, mitzvahs, moral courage, whatever those decisions are, deeply, deeply affect history, we also know that the instrumentation for history's trajectory is politics and wars and diplomacy, and our people are now getting close to having been at war for about 2 years now, and we're suffering the toll and carrying the weight of being at war for so long. But it's important specifically for people in our community to, especially now that there's a bit of a break, I know we're still fighting in Gaza, and we're wishing all of our chayalim to come back safely. Shuv Hashem, Rivavos Alfei Yisrael V'nocha Yamar, they should come back safely, and certainly towards hopefully what will be the end of this war. We should end without any sour notes, without any losses. Hashem should be Kum Hashem v'yafutzu oivecha v'yanusu misanecha miponecha. Our enemies should flee as they have fled in the north. They should continue to flee in the south. But especially now that we have a little bit of time to think and to ponder, especially to ponder the nisim that we've been zocha to, and those nisim Hashem delivered to us because of schus avos, because of our schus of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, because of our schus of Mesiras Nefesh v'Kiddush Hashem, because of all the schuyas of Jewish history of Avas Yisrael, but also because of the Torah we continue to learn, and the tefillos we continue to daven, and the Maisim Tovim, and the Moshlim B'Yitzram, the way we continue to conduct ourselves in the spirit of Moshlim B'Yitzram. And that's what makes it so satirical, because you read A and you think that it's the literal reading, the Moshlim and the Cheshbon and the leaders and the diplomats, and then the undercurrent is not really A, it's anti-A. It's what you don't see in the headlines, what gets hidden. I always remind myself of my grandfather, my Zaidi, who was living in White Russia around the early 1920s. I may be off if there's anyone in my family, my large family, which I'll allude to a little bit later, listening to this. And at some point, the pogroms and the discrimination and the anti-Semitism of Russia was just so much that he made the decision to pick up and move to America. And he moved alone, and he saved his pennies, and he brought over his brothers and his parents. And today, I don't know how many people with the last name Tarragon, Ashkenazi Tarragon, or Sephardi Tarragons out there also, probably our ancient relatives, but how many, every Ashkenazi Tarragon, we're all related. We're all one very, very large, big family. And it was one quiet decision, brave decision, courageous decision of my Zadian, and the decisions that rippled afterwards. And I always ask myself, if you go back and read the newspapers of that day that he decided to leave Russia and journey to America, and you'd read the headlines and who was deciding what and what policies were being shaped and what post-World War I, and those are just the sands of history. They wash in, they wash out, they come in, they come out, the tides of history, high and low. And nothing from that time really has lasting impact. And everything is just a cycle and a circle. And yet my grandfather's decision, which was quiet, which wasn't covered in any headlines, that decision, I think, is shaping history like everyone's brave. Now, it's not because my last name is Tarek, not because it's my grandfather. I'm sure many people listening to this shir can think back to similar brave and courageous decisions that people in their past made that didn't make headlines, but when you look at it 80 years later, 90 years later, 100 years later, it reshapes history. So be careful about not getting too caught up in the headlines. And I keep saying this, particularly from people in Chutz La'aretz, because when I travel to Chutz La'aretz, I sometimes feel like people are so longing to connect to Israel. And from afar, the easiest way to long and to connect is to open up the news and to be up to date with what's happening in this battlefield and that battlefield. And sometimes you can get dragged into this vortex of headlines. And number one, as I've said so often, not look beyond the headlines into the spirit of our battle. But also, it's hard to feel that your personal experiences have meaning and impact in a war that's being fought collectively and nationally thousands of miles away. And you really are holding the gun, proverbially, and driving the tank, proverbially, and in the cockpit over the skies of Iran, proverbially. Not that we don't need chas v'shalom, we shouldn't be grateful to, but in addition to that, just know that, especially during war, your decisions, whatever those decisions are, they can be decisions that express themselves in the ritual world, more learning Torah, more kavana during davening, more commitment to mitzvos, or they could be decisions that express themselves in the religious world, which isn't ritual. Notice I use the word religion, just being a kinder person, being better to your spouse, being a better parent, being more honest, being more respectful for people. I think sometimes when we think about upping our game and bringing our A game, when Am Yisrael means it, we immediately default to how much more Torah am I going to learn, how many more siyum am I going to make, how many Perkei Tehillim, and they're all important. And if you're able to, those should be summoned as well. But it's also, have I changed my personality? I mean, if there are people at war defending you, and you feel like they're laying your lives on the line, maybe you should be a little less petty. Maybe you should be a little less angry the next time. And sometimes that packs a moral punch that's a lot stronger than just the Tehillim and the learning, for different reasons. It's easier to disconnect the Tehillim and the learning from people's heroism and sacrifice. Whereas if people are sacrificing, the least you owe them is to just be a better person and a bigger man and a bigger woman and less petty and less jealous and less weak and less lazy and less distracted, whatever that less is. So this is a beautiful, beautiful Gemara. It's in Bava Basra, Daf Ayin Chesed Beis. It's a classic satire. Torah is describing one thing, but it subverts it, almost sabotages it through the drasha of the Gemara in Bava Basra, that the real Moshlim are not the people who seem to control the fates of other people, but the people who control their own inner battle, their own inner struggle. And just to give you Maramakom, this Gemara in Bava Basra, it may sound familiar to you, is the Gemara that Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, leads with in Mesilas Yesharim. It's the Gemara he quotes to talk about the importance of Cheshbon HaNefesh and controlling your moral impulses. So it's a well-known Gemara, and it's a beautiful satire, and especially living through historical moments. Remember, you and I shape history in the inner quadrants of our heart and our experience. The same way we also shape history in the skies of Tehran and the borders of Eretz Yisrael.